There's a saying, always keep the main thing the main thing. When it comes to Chanukah, we have to make sure we know what the main theme and thrust of Chanukah is, and at the same time, we have to acknowledge the ancillary themes as well. And that's what we do in Valanissim, as we'll see in this Sikha. The Nusach von Valanissim for Chanukah sagt man, in the language, in the formula for Valanissim, we say, that after the miraculous victory against the Yevonim, your children, meaning the Chashmonoim, came into the Beis HaMikdash, and they cleared the Heichal, and they purified the Beis HaMikdash, and they lit lights in the courtyards of the holy courtyards. So as you're doing them, there's a well-known question about this. What do you mean they lit the candles in the courtyards? What do you mean they lit candles outside in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash? The place of the menorah, which surely is the centerpiece of the Chanukah miracle, is inside the Heichal, not in the outer courtyard. So the Chassam Sofer has a fascinating explanation built on what the Rambam tells us about the fact that a non-Kohen could theoretically light the menorah. So the Chassam Sofer answers this based on the ruling of the Rambam. That technically a non-Kohen could light the candles of the menorah. Therefore, if the Kohen prepared the lamps of the menorah and then took the menorah outside of the Heichal into the courtyard, then a non-Kohen could light the menorah because he's allowed to be in that precinct. So based on that concept, the Chassam Sofer is going to tell us there was a reason to light the menorah outside in the courtyard. What was that reason? Because the Yevonim contaminated the Heichal. And the Heichal was filled with their idols. Says the Chassam Sofer, while they were going through the process of clearing and purifying the Heichal and the Beis HaMikdash, they could not light the menorah inside where it normally belongs, so they lit the menorah outside in the courtyard, and that's what Valanissim is referring to according to the Chassam Sofer. And the fire is the Nes Nispasen Gevon Sala Eden, and by the way, that also advertised the miracle to everybody, that they could see that the oil of one day lasted for 8. Because everybody could see the menorah which was out in the public, and they could see that it burned for 8 days. Because if they had lit the menorah where it belongs, inside the Heichal, argues the Chassam Sofer, then only the Kohanim would have actually seen the miracle themselves. Great answer, but we have to really think about the answer that the Chassam Sofer is giving, for a few reasons. Number one, the chronology of Valanissim does not lend itself to his explanation. Aleph, from Pashas Eloshen, Bo, they came into the Beis HaMikdash. Step 1. Then, Upino v'tiaru, they cleared and purified the Heichal in the Beis HaMikdash. Step 2. Then, v'hidliku, they lit the candles. Is mashmaz the v'hidliku is given noch dem v'pino seichel echol v'tiaru is mikdashecha. That would imply that they only lit the lights of the menorah after they had cleared out the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, there are no idols inside the Heichal. Und also ist muchach euch von dem, was es steht bekommen mit Kaimis, as the Shem Chanukah is Shem Chanukahs am Mizbeach v'amikdash, and that's one of the reasons we call the holiday Chanukah, because it represents the initiation or reinitiation of the Beis HaMikdash and of the Mizbeach. Because it had been desecrated and defiled by the Yevonim, so it had to be reconsecrated. In other words, so that happened on the 25th of Kislev, and therefore the lighting of the candles, which was also on the 25th of Kislev, is after the Beis HaMikdash was cleared out. There are no idols to worry about. Why is the Chassam Sofer saying they could not light the menorah inside the Beis HaMikdash? You may have a question about this. How was it possible for them to do all of that work in a single day? Okay, good question. But we're not going to focus on that. Rather, the order in which the Valanissim is presented indicates that the lighting of the menorah was after they cleared out and cleaned the Beis HaMikdash. Question number 2, Beis. But Pashtus, what makes you think that the Yevonim only put their idols inside the Heichal? But Pashtus, some of the Yevonim are reingebracht, Hilulim nit, nor in Heichal, nor in alle Teilen from Beis HaMikdash, kol de Azora. Surely the Yevonim littered the entire precinct of the Beis HaMikdash with idols, which includes the courtyards. As is implied in the formula of the Valanissim, which is v'tiharu es mikdashecha, that they had to purify the whole Beis HaMikdash. It's a generic term. Stam mehot metar given them ganzen Beis HaMikdash, implying that they had to purify the entire Beis HaMikdash, implying that there were idols throughout the entire Beis HaMikdash. If that's the case, so what would the logic then be to say that they cleared and purified the courtyard before they cleared and purified the inner sanctum? And 8 days of purifying the heichal after they've purified the kotzer. That's why the menorah is outside for 8 days. And that's why it was practical to light the menorah in the courtyard and not inside the heichal. Doesn't seem to be a logical explanation. And you can't say, well, the reason is because they also wanted to publicize the miracle. That's why they kept the menorah outside, which is something the Chasam Sofer mentioned. Because obviously when they originally lit the menorah, at least the first time, they didn't yet know there's going to be a miracle, so you don't know that you have to publicize anything. Why would they light the menorah outside? Gimel b'chol oifen, plus, whichever way you look at it, this explanation that the Chasam Sofer gives explains why the reference is to lighting in the courtyard rather than in the heichal. But it doesn't explain why it's in courtyards in the plural. Right? How come in Vala Nissen do we say that they lit the candles, the lamps, the lights in the courtyards, plural of the Beis Hamikdash? Why doesn't it say in the singular in the courtyard, otherwise known as the Azara, which according to the Chasam Sofer is where the menorah went? Especially when the rest of Vala Nissen before this is all in the singular. All singular words. And now we're changing to a plural word, bechatzros. So it doesn't seem so obvious that we could just simply say the reason they lit the menorah outside was because they had no option, because they couldn't use the inside of the heichal. And therefore it would seem to be that the lamps we're talking about in Vala Nisim are not necessarily the menorah. These lamps, neiros b'chatzis kochecha that the Vala Nisim is referring to, it's not the menorah. Not under the neiros, was not gezündet als ein Hillel v'shevach zum Eibishter. Rather, these are other lamps or candles that they lit to show praise and gratitude to the Eibishter. And that's not surprising to us because it's something we see in many places in Torah. We have precedent for the idea that one of the ways to praise Hashem is by lighting lamps. Where do we see it? First, it's a pasuk in Yeshaya that you honor Hashem with lamps, with lights. And that becomes a halacha that you're supposed to have many candles in a shul, many lights in a shul, out of praise to Hashem. And here's an example that is relevant to the Beis Hamikdash, which is obviously apropos our conversation. That at the time of the great celebration during Sukkot, that they lit many golden menorahs in the women's courtyard, and they were so bright they illuminated the entire Yerushalayim. Why did they do it? As part of the Simcha, which is the theme of praise to Hashem, that happened on Simchas Beis HaSha'eva. So there's a concept of lighting candles as a sign of praise. That's what Vala Nisim is referring to. And now we have to re-punctuate or recreate the pauses that we make when we read Vala Nisim. Not like we thought, which is pause, that these things happen in that sequence, that they cleared out the Beis Hamikdash and then they lit the menorah. Rather, you have to say, pause. That was the process that they did in order to clean the Beis Hamikdash. Then, goes to the Hodos Shimcha Gadol, that they lit candles in order to praise the Eibishter. Because the message over here is, at that time they lit many, many candles, as we now establish an 8-day holiday of Chanukah. For what purpose? In order to give gratitude and praise to Hashem. Okay, so if these are not menorah candles, these are other candles, then you immediately understand why they are in the courtyards in the plural. because the candles or the lamps that were lit out of gratitude to Hashem and praise of Hashem were not limited to the Azara. But they were in the Ezras Nashim, which is of course a lesser holy area of the Beis Hamikdash, and other courtyards around the Beis Hamikdash, because they wanted to show the praise of Hashem as much as possible. So now we're no longer talking about the menorah in Vala Nisim, we're talking about the lights that were lit in order to praise Hashem for the miracles of Chanukah. The thing is, what then is very strange about Vala Nisim is, then are you telling me Vala Nisim does not mention the menorah then? Because the only reference to candles is this one. So are you telling me now that Vala Nisim recognizes the fact that they lit generic candles out of praise of Hashem and doesn't say a word, not even a hint about the menorah? Based on what we've just explained, as in the Nusach Vala Nisim that implies that in Vala Nisim there's no mention, there's not even a hint of the primary aspect of Chanukah, which is the menorah. We're celebrating the miracle of the oil of the menorah. According to this, the only miracle mentioned in Vala Nisim is the victory of the war. That you gave the weak into the hands, that you gave the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, and you gave a great salvation. So you're telling me Vala Nisim, which is for Chanukah, doesn't mention the Nes Hashem? The Tmir is noch Gresser. What makes that even more perplexing is when the Gemara tells us what Chanukah is all about, it defines it as the miracle of the oil, not the miracle of the war. The Gemara is in Shabbos. The Gemara says, "My Chanukah." What is Chanukah? Rashi is Duruf and Farish, which Rashi explains to mean Al Eizer Neis Kavuha. What Neis did they use to establish Chanukah? And he explains that when the Yavanim burst into the Heichel, they contaminated all of the oil. And they only found one little cruse of oil that still had the seal of the Kohen Gadol. And even though it was only enough oil for a single day, they made a miracle that it lasted and burnt for 8 days. The following year, they made these days of Chanukah as days of celebration. And how do you celebrate? Hallel, giving gratitude to Hashem, and Hoida'ah, mentioning and acknowledging the miracles. Where is the Hoida'ah? Where do you acknowledge the miracles? The praise and acknowledging the miracles, which is Ala Nisim beHoida'ah, the fact that we add the paragraph Ala Nisim in the section of Shemona Esrei, which is called Hoida'ah, in other words, by Moedim. So Vala Nisim is supposed to fulfill what the Gemara said, that they established Chanukah as a time to acknowledge and thank the Eibishter for the miracles. How do you do that? Supposedly by acknowledging the main miracle of my Chanukah, what Chanukah is all about, which is the miracle of the oil. So how is it possible that you could have the Va'ala Nisim, which is supposed to be the moment of acknowledging the great miracle of Chanukah, without acknowledging the miracle of Chanukah, without saying one word about my Chanukah, what the key Chanukah is all about? So to understand this, we've got to remind ourselves, what was the battle all about over Chanukah? So there is a very well-known question about the Gemara, and it's addressing that question that's going to give us insight into our conversation. Surely the main miracle was the small Hashmonoi army defeating this massive Yevoni army. So how come then, according to the Gemara, did they not establish the miracle of Chanukah, the celebration of Chanukah, to commemorate the great miracle of the victory of the war? But instead it's all about the miracle of that little bit of oil. Surely, how did they take something which appears to be secondary and override the main thing? The Jews survived the major onslaught. State of them the beer, so the explanation is as brought in Chassidus, as the Ikar Gzera b'mei Chanukah is need given if the Gufim von Eden, that the primary decrees of the Yevonim against the Jews at the time of Chanukah was not a physical threat to our existence, nor Ivdas Yisrael, but rather it was an assault on our religion, on our beliefs. Batlu dasam, as the Rambam calls it. As we say in Vala Nisim, that they wanted to cease Hashem's Torah, and they wanted to get us away from fulfilling the super-rational mitzvahs called Chukim. Or Kamayim Chazal, as the Gemara tells us, that they threatened the Jewish people. We want you to carve out onto the horn of an ox that you have no portion with the God of Israel. That's the battle, to disconnect Jews from Judaism, more importantly, to disconnect Jews from God. The fact that there were wars, physical wars, that's just because they couldn't get what they wanted in this particular sense of moving us away from Judaism, and we had to fight to defend it. Und der Rebbe hat ihn gemacht an Iker, nicht von dem Nest in dem Zochen am Milchama der Atzolas Aguf. Seeing as Chanukah was not an assault on the human body, therefore they didn't make the miracle about the success of the human body being saved. Nor von Es Hashemen, rather we made Chanukah all about the miracle of the oil, the Nes verbunden mit der Mitzvah in Beis HaMikdash, because at the first level, it's the celebration of a mitzvah in the Beis HaMikdash that they looked to cancel. Or in them Gufa, not just any mitzvah, but mit Menorah HaMikdash, a mitzvah that had to do with the lamps of the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash, versus Meramis, if Klolos Inyan HaTorah mitzvah. We know that the lamps of the menorah represent the whole of Torah mitzvahs, as the pasuk says, Ner mitzvah v'Torah, or that mitzvahs are compared to a candle and Torah to light, so therefore the menorah is symbolic of the whole concept of Torah mitzvahs, which was under threat by the Yevonim at the time. All of that is associated or connected with the spiritual salvation that took place, because that's the epicenter of Chanukah. The only thing we need to understand is when the Gemara addresses the question, what is Chanukah all about? What miracle is the anchor for the celebration of Chanukah? The interesting thing is the Gemara only talks about the miracle of the oil. It doesn't say anything about the miracle of the victory of the war. I mean, it is a miracle. Surely it deserves to be mentioned, at least. The Gemara says, no, the only thing about the war that the Gemara mentions is the Gemara just gives us the background as an introduction to, and to give us the time frame. That after the Chashmonoim beat the Yevonim, then they looked for oil and they couldn't find it. So that's the only mention you have of the war, is that it gives us the context. Und zweitens, der Nes von Nitzochen am Melchama, and the miracle of the victory of that war, that the strong fell into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, not mentioned at all in the Gemara. Now, just generically, there was a victory. This is a major victory. Why don't you tell us? Huge miracles. Isn't it moving? It doesn't make sense. As the Iko von Chanukah is the Atzola Ruchnis. We get it. The main theme of Chanukah is that we were spiritually saved from an assault against the sanctity of Judaism. But you cannot ignore that there was also physical salvation, and in a completely supernatural way. Besides, you could never have achieved the spiritual victory without first achieving the physical victory. So the spiritual victory is thanks to and follows after the physical victory. You don't even mention it. Al kol ponim b'derech tofel, not even as a secondary element. Surely the Gemara should have at least had one line to acknowledge that there was a physical victory. But you have to keep the main thing. The Bira in their explanation is this. In many places in Chassidus and in the Rebbe's Sichos, we've discussed the idea of the war of the Yevonim. It's not a generic war against Judaism. They had a very specific issue that they took umbrage with. Now the dirk is in them is given ashkicham Torah shelcha. The issue is they wanted us to forget that the Torah is the Eibishter's Torah, and as a result, that we should not fulfill the chukim, which are super rational mitzvahs. In other words, the Yevonim hat nicht gehabt as they feel was didn't learn in Torah. As we know, Chassidus, the Yevonim did not really care so much that Jews learned Torah. You have your philosophy, we have ours. Obviously, the Havdil. The Zweck von Zegzer is given ashkicham Torah secha. The goal of their attack and their decrees was that we should forget that it's the Eibishter's Torah. So machen vergessen, as the Torah is dein Torah, Torah savai, was is hecher von seichel. They wanted us to forget that the Torah is Hashem's Torah, which is beyond the rational. They wanted us to stop observing those mitzvahs that are super rational mitzvahs. They didn't want us to fulfill those mitzvahs that require you to acknowledge something beyond the human mind. And say, Kim is not mit Kabbalah, so that you only fulfill those mitzvahs because you accept Hashem's authority. Because that's what the Eibishter wants. The Meibishter's Ratzon. That's what the Yevonim are fighting against. The Mechemes Yevonim is given gegen dem, was bei ihnen ist Göttlichkeit im ganzen Hecher von Gidrei Habria. The main issue the Yevonim had with Jews is that Jews say godliness is fundamentally and infinitely beyond the natural order. And can never be grasped by intellect, certainly not by human intellect. And of course, the Yevonim prided themselves in human intellect. For them, that was the apex of all existence. Das ist eine von den Biurim in dem, was in von Chanukah bescheichert zu der Zolurchnis, ist gewinn verbunden mit Neres HaMenorah Dafka. Because their war was against the very specific, pristine version of Yiddishkeit, that it's godly, that we have a connection to an Eibishter who is higher than Seichel, that's why the miracle played out specifically to do with light. Die Yevonim haben doch mit Tame gewinnt dem ganzen Beis HaMikdash und hat gedacht, mechanich sein dem Mizbech v'chol klei ha'heichel. Why are we making such a fuss about the light and the menorah and the oil? Because the Yevonim would appear contaminated the entire Beis HaMikdash, and that's why it's called Chanukah, because they had to reconsecrate everything. Was hat der Eibishter gemacht, as the Nes soll sein bescheichert zu Neres HaMenorah Dafka? Why did the Eibishter craft it in such a way that the miracle should specifically be a miracle which is relevant to the menorah, to the lights of the menorah? So when we understand what light is, then we'll understand why the miracle of Chanukah is a miracle of light, and why that captures what we did in pushing off or defeating the Yevonim. Ist in dem gefindt, als wenn wir bezeichnen in Ruchni, ist ein Rogel zu nutzen der Muskel und Moschel von Eur. So we know in Hasidus, but generically, that when people want to convey a spiritual idea, they use the metaphor of light. Or starting from the pasuk that calls a mitzvah a candle and Torah light. Why is that? So for the time, there are various answers, various explanations. One of them is, Eur is ois geteilt von allen Evroim der mit, what distinguishes light from all other physical things is, despite the fact that light is a physical entity, a physical creation, it's physical without being completely, so to speak, held in the physical realm. What does that mean? So we're going to look at three things to compare just to understand the power and uniqueness of light. So let's look at the distinction between sound, sight, and smell. When it comes to a sound, the Gemara rules that sound is not something really tangible. And that has practical halachic implications. For example, you can't steal the sound of a shofar. So even though if I had to compare sound to, let's say, a block of wood, I would say a block of wood is tangible and sound is not. But the fact is, sound is something that you can trace, that you can track, that you can sense in the physical realm, to noise from the Maver Gashmi, because it creates sound waves. And those sound waves can be so palpable that you can actually feel it. You can actually feel the vibration, physical vibration from the sound wave. So even though sound is ethereal, it's actually quite tangible too at a point. Similarly, smell. Smell is an intangible, and yet, smell obviously is not the physical item wafting across the room to you. It's something that's exuding from the item. So if you have a beautiful fruit that smells very rich, the smell that's coming to you is not a piece of the fruit. Yet, the smell is linked to the physical point of origin, which means it's actually, what is smell? It is actually molecules breaking off that original fruit that are now traveling as particles of smell. That's why the smell can eventually dissipate and disappear altogether. Whereas vision has nothing to do with the physical thing that you're seeing. It's not like there's some piece of the item that is dissipating into the air and that's what you're seeing, nor are there sight waves that are coming your way. That explains why when we want to describe something spiritual, we call it or, we call it light. Because out of all physical things, light is the most spiritual of physical things. It's the least tangible of all physical things. The Bir Nalbani gets once we have this insight into light and what it represents, that helps us understand another statement that Chazal tell us about the menorah. A very interesting statement. It's a beautiful statement until you actually analyze it. That the menorah is testimony to the entire world that the Shekhinah is within the Jewish nation. How do you see that the Shekhinah is with the Jewish people in the menorah? Because you had the Ner Ma'aravi, the central wick, the central lamp, that just burnt and burnt and burnt. You started it, lighting from it, and it was the one that you concluded at the end to clean and replace. It just completely behaved beyond the natural expectation. So the Lecher is nicht moving, doesn't seem to make any sense. Was ist ein Ness von Ner Ma'aravi ausgeteilt von alle Asoren Nisim, was Nasi Lav Seder Bebeis HaMikdash? We need something to illustrate that the divine presence lives with the Jewish people. So we're going to pick a miracle that happened in the Beis HaMikdash. Which do we pick? The Ner Ma'aravi of the menorah. Now there are 9 other, or at least 9 other miracles that are described about the Beis HaMikdash. So why is this the one? That's the evidence that the Eibush is with us. In fact, if you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense. The menorah is gestanden in the Heichel, wo nicht jeder hat gekannt da reingehen. The menorah is in the Heichel where just about nobody was permitted to enter. Whereas many of the other miracles were in the public, in the Azorah. Whether it was the fact that there were no flies, whether it's the fact that nobody passed out from the smell of the korbanos, etc. The fact that you could go into the Azorah and owned in Tzvufim, that there was enough place for everybody. These are things that people saw and experienced firsthand, tangibly. Surely the other miracles were more advertised than the miracle of the Ner Ma'aravi on the menorah, and that's the one that's going to symbolize the fact that the Shekhinah is with us. Now let's just move on. When we understand what light is, we understand how the light of the menorah is the sign of the Eibish's presence. Because light is the most appropriate container or channel for divine light. When we take the supernal light of the divine presence, which is completely beyond our world, and we then plug it into a physical light, which is the light of the menorah, that has an incredible impact, and it illuminates the world with the light of Shekhinah. Und der Pfarrer darf gedennes mit dem Eure HaMenorah beeinflussen die Olam, sie sollen erkennen, Shashchina Shore B'Yisrael. So yes, the people didn't actually physically see that light, but because of the design of the Beis HaMikdash, where the windows were designed to radiate light outwards, and the light of the menorah now has an impact on the world, and it carries within it the light of the Shekhinah, even without them actually physically seeing the light impacts them to have a consciousness that the Eibush is with the Jewish people. Und damit ist euch verstandig, was der Zoller Ruchnis von Chanukah ist gewinn verbunden mit Nes von Pach Hashem und der HaMenorah. Now that we understand what light is, what it represents, how it connects to Hashem's light, we can appreciate why the primary miracle that is celebrated on Chanukah is the miracle of light. Das nicht kein seitiger Nes. It's not just incidental. They needed oil and they had to light the menorah, so Hashem made a miracle. Now, in the miracle of the oil and therefore the miracle of the lights captures the essence of what the whole Chanukah victory is all about. Because Chanukah is all about acknowledging that the Torah is not a philosophy, it's divine philosophy. And the mitzvahs are not a great way for a person to make tikkun olam or something like that, but it's the Eibish's super-rational instructions. These are evidence to the fact that within the Jewish experience, within the Jewish person, you can feel the illumination of divine light, which is completely beyond the world. It's beyond human intellect and it's beyond the parameters of the physical, natural reality. Is in Aleph Anes Shenesu Murum Ulamayim Megedra Teva. So how can you tell that the Eibush is with the Jewish people that we're connected to the Eibush's light, which is beyond nature? Because a miracle happens, and that's beyond nature. But more specifically, what kind of a miracle? A miracle that has to do with light, and specifically the light of the menorah. From Bria, that in turn is a vessel, a conduit for divine light that is beyond the created reality. Which is why this is the evidence that the Shekhinah is with the Jewish people. Now you can understand why when the Gemara asks the question, what is Chanukah all about? Which is the primary miracle of Chanukah? Then you can understand why the Gemara only mentions the miracle of the light and nothing to do with the miracle of the war. Because if I'm talking about the essence of Chanukah, what is Chanukah really truly all about? It's truly all about the light of Chanukah, which represent the light of Torah, which is beyond the world, which is what the Yevonim wanted to snuff out. Is das der Nest von Eres Chanukah, welcher weist auf dem Ner Ruchni in der Mitzvah, was hat mehr gewinnt durch ein Nitzachon Ruchni. So what is Chanukah all about? It is all about preserving the authenticity, the integrity of the divine light that is beyond the world, which was represented in the lights of Chanukah. And even though the victory, the physical victory, was the precursor to be able to actually get to the point that you could light this menorah, because without the physical victory, they could never have recaptured and reconsecrated the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore they could never have relit the menorah. Von deswegen, nachdem wir hat schon dem Nes Ruchni is a davar v'nes gashmi tefes makim. But once you have the spiritual miracle, the physical miracle is no longer relevant. It was just a means to this end. Was der Held der tefes makim da is nit derch meim chazal shage betira maya hani, and the degree to which the physical war is now irrelevant is even less than the statement Chazal usually make about what is the value of a candle in the face of the sun. In other words, there's so much light, this little light is irrelevant. No, we're not even saying that. So there, even though the light of the sun is obviously multiple times stronger than the light of a candle, and the light of the sun is a different quality of light to the light of a candle, but the fact is a candle still is a producer of light. It's just that it's an insignificant producer of light compared to that light. We're talking about something much more than that. In our case, it's completely different. It's the compared to the divine energy, the divine light that was radiated and exposed through the miracle of Chanukah, where the light of Chanukah is an expression of the divine light that is completely beyond the physical, natural reality. A physical victory, no matter how miraculous, doesn't even feature. It's not even relevant at all. It's like nothing happened compared to the greatness of exposing Hashem's L'mayla min hateva reality into the world. With all of that information, we could plug it in the opposite way and understand why Aval HaNisim, surprisingly, does not mention the menorah. It is appropriate that we give gratitude to Hashem for the miracle of the war, and we do that. Where do we do it? In Aval HaNisim. Then, you cannot, in the same paragraph, in the same statement, give gratitude for the miracle of the oil, because the minute you mention the miracle of the oil, the miracle of the war is irrelevant. And because it's appropriate that I should also give gratitude for the miracle of the war, I dare not mention the miracle of the light at that point, because then my gratitude is moot. That's why we separate two different occasions through Chanukah to acknowledge each of the miracles, because each needs its own space. The primary place where we give gratitude to Hashem for the main miracle of Chanukah, which is exponentially beyond the miracle of the war, that's when we light the menorah. And that's really what Chanukah is all about. And we also have to acknowledge the Eibishter's miracle that gave us the victory of the war. So we do that too. We're in Va'al Nisim, and we keep it just about the war, because if we were to introduce the miracle of the light at that point, the war would be completely irrelevant. Everything that the Torah teaches has to have a practical lesson and instruction for us in our service of the Eibishter. Here there's a simple message. Von Chanukah nennt man den Koach, als bei Eden soll leichen der Eir an Neshama, bis in an Öfen, als die Nyone Aguf shel Adam sollen bei ihm nicht Tefes Mokim sein. Chanukah gives us the ability that the light of our Neshama should shine so brightly that our physical things effectively fall by the wayside and are irrelevant. Warum? Because if you think about it, despite the fact that the Neshama currently is living inside a body, it's invested in a body. Und da in der Masse kann die Neshama nicht sein dienen dem Eibischen sei durch den Guf. And the truth is, as long as the Neshama is on earth, it has no other means to serve the Eibishter except with the assistance of and through the body. Alle mitzvahs, seine mitvorim gashmim dafka, every mitzvah requires physical implements. Even the intellect and emotion of a person has to actually be manifest through the physical brain, through the feeling in the heart. Then Chanukah comes to teach us that a Yid has the ability that the Gashmius of this world will be absolutely irrelevant to him. Men redt nicht wegen Gashmius, was ist verbunden mit Avodas HaNeshama. We're not talking about Gashmius that has to do with the Avodah of the Neshama, because as a Gashmius darf man lechatchila nicht sein, because such Gashmius should never exist. No, it should be b'chol drachecha shelcha da'eyu Hashem. That everything that you're doing should be completely focused towards the Eibush, not about Gashmius. Now, viele Gashmius was für Zuruchnis, but even Gashmius, let's go back. Gashmius was nicht verbunden mit Avodas HaNeshama. If, God forbid, there's some kind of Gashmi activity that is not linked to the Neshama, that cannot be on my agenda, cannot be part of my experience, because everything has to be b'chol drachecha da'eyu. Not only that, but even Gashmis, which is there to facilitate spirituality, like the victory of the war of Chanukah, which facilitates us being able to have the miracle of Chanukah. We have to work on ourselves as the Gashmis that the Gashmis, even though we're using it, shouldn't have value for us. The whole purpose, as far as we're concerned, the entire reality of this Gashmis is only, it is purely just tools and resources to use to do what the Neshama needs. That should be our attitude to Gashmis. And needless to say, if we do that, we'll be very successful and be able to bring the Ur Neshama, the Ur which is beyond this world, into our lives and have tremendous atzlacha in our connection to the Eibishter.